Thank you so much, Dawn. Good morning. Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control who lives, who dies, who tells your story. And when you're gone, who remembers your name? Who keeps your flame? Who tells your story? These lyrics are from the Broadway hit Hamilton, and they express the central theme of the show. Who tells your story if it is told? The lyrics resonate powerfully for me, and they direct my comments this morning. Who will tell the stories of the Texans whose lives have been considered invisible, irrelevant, inconsequential, and insignificant? Who will tell the stories that will provide a larger, fuller telling of our past? Who will tell the stories of the Texans who were making and living history, but were not allowed to speak it? And seldom were they heard in public. My name is Lupita Barrera. Who knows what generation Texan I am? My DNA indicates I'm 67% Spanish and other Mediterranean ethnicities, and 27% indigenous. So who knows? My ancestors could have been roaming these Texas lands for millennia. My parents and grandparents were born in Texas. My great-great-great-greats came to New Spain about 1500s. And then in 1750, they moved north with José de Escandón, colonizer of Nuevo Santander. We're cousins. Nuevo Santander was a province that spread from the current state of Tamaulipas, all of it, the Mexican state of Tamaulipas, all the way up to the Nueces River. Nuevo Santander was created in part to stimulate the economy, to bring more growth, more population into these desolate lands, and to discourage any foreign encroachment. With Escandón, these settlers founded and settled villages on both sides of the Rio Grande, the banks of the Rio Grande, north side and south side. The river was not a border. It was a source of life. They built their homes there, and they ranched, and they raised livestock, sheep, goats, horses. Theirs was not an easy life. When there was no water, they dug deep wells whose skeletal remains are still in South Texas. It was either feast or famine. It was drought or flood. It was disease. It was Indian raids, but they persisted. Their industry would later develop to Texas's ranching empires. Think about this a minute. These settlements were decades before the Alamo, which is usually where Texas history starts. Who will tell their story? My rich Spanish, Indian, Mexican heritage was not taught to me in school. It was not in any of the books. What I remember is the name Cabeza de Vaca. And what fourth grader wants to associate with the head of a cow? The Alamo story, I honestly don't remember learning it in school. What I do remember is my older brother coming into the house with this little booklet in hand, Texas History Movies, published in 1943 by Magnolia Petroleum Company, and he's laughing and he's saying to me, he wants to show me something, he wants to show me a cartoon. And he brings the book out and he's flipping through it. He knows exactly where he wants to show me, and he points to it, and I look, and there is, I think it's a Texan with musket in hand, high above his head, saying, "Down with the tamale eaters." I was aghast. I was embarrassed. I was humiliated. I was angry. I was ashamed. I am Texan, and I love tamales. Who will tell their story? Our lives were full of contradictions. Speaking Spanish in school was not allowed. Corporal punishment if you were caught. And corporal punishment meant paddling with a big wooden paddle about the size of about the size of a small rowboat oar. At home, you spoke Spanish to your grandparents, to your elders. You listened to Mexican music. You loved Mexican food. And the jokes, chistes, hilarious because it's mostly a play on words in Spanish. And then we would sit on the front porch with my grandparents, and they would tell us stories about Spanish explorations, about vaqueros, about land, about wells, about fiestas, about sheep and goats, about cattle drives, and they went on and on and on. And when we were ill, we were treated with medicinal herbs that actually worked. We heard about revolts that their ancestors had against their government for more freedoms and justice. We heard about passionate attorneys like Gus Garcia and J.T. Canales. We heard about strong women like Jovita Hidar and Emilia Ramirez. And they always ended with the question, why do you suppose there are so many Spanish names in our Texas geography? Our family were setting the groundworks of facts. Most importantly, they were setting the attitude and establishing our process of becoming. And what do I mean as the process of becoming? James L. Haley expresses best, everything that you believe in this world that's important, what's right, what's wrong, what's moral, what's immoral, how you should live, vote, worship, raise your children, everything you believe filters like coffee through what you ever understood about history or not. It informs everything about what kind of a human being you are. Who will tell the students of today their story? Who will establish their process of becoming? A day or two before my parents drove me to Southwest Texas State College, that's what it was called back then, my dad took me aside and he said, listen, this was all in Spanish, listen, you may not be popular, where you're going. In fact, people may shun you and avoid you. And then he proceeded to tell me a story. In the 1930s, he was a young man in San Diego, Texas. He was looking for work, but he did not dare venture to Corpus Christi. ¿Por qué, papá? Why? Because they were rounding up Mexicans and sending them back to Mexico. Why? He said, they didn't want Mexicans here. Look at me. Look at you. Broke my heart to this day. Does it make me less proud of being a Texan? No. Now I have learning that story gave me a deeper understanding of our human story, our Texas story. We've come a long way since my baby days. Now there's all sorts of exhibits on different ethnicities. Thank you to the Institute of Texan Cultures, who in 1968 did a phenomenal job with all of their exhibits on diverse cultures, and they followed up with the Texans One and All series, which we still use to this day. Now you can move around Texas and see historical markers that talk about people, places, events that you'd forgotten or maybe had been erased. There's fabulous websites now. Texas A&M in San Antonio is working with Edgewood School District to start a program called Self, Community, and Culture for sixth graders. The best review about the program is a sixth grader said, "I learned all about me." The TEA has approved 4 social studies courses: Mexican American, Asian American, Indigenous American, and African American, and we're waiting for women's studies. History textbooks are full of information on cultural diversity. We are making strides to offer different perspectives, but we have more to go. Enter the Texas Center at Schreiner University. I was thrilled to see Schreiner's enrollment in the fall of 2021 is 1,103, and 38% of those students identify as Hispanic. And I can guarantee you, if they have roots in South Texas, they will connect to the Escandon story. 4% of the students are Black, and a smaller percentage is Asian American, who will tell their stories. Schreiner's numbers reflect what is happening in Texas today. Hispanics are now 41% of the population and growing, exceeding all other groups, certainly by 2050. Asians are the fastest growing. As we've heard before, English, Spanish most commonly spoken in Texas, followed by Vietnamese and Chinese. I have been so fortunate in all my years to be able to talk about the untold stories. And when I had interviews with people, often they would say to me, "No one has ever asked me these stories. I've waited a long time." The wait is over. The Texas Center at Schreiner University can offer a place where a fuller Texas story can be told for all Texans. Thank you so very much.
Over Easter weekend in 2004, the John Lee Hancock feature film, The Alamo, opened nationwide in theaters. And I marked that occasion because I'd just spent the last year and a half working as the film's historical advisor. So I thought it would be nice to take my mom and my Aunt Catha to see the movie that I'd been working on. So I went over to my Aunt Catha's house in Pflugerville. And we're getting ready to leave, and her 19-year-old granddaughter breezes through the house, says, "Hi, Gran, what you doing?" She says, "Well, we're going to go see the movie that Stephen worked on." She said, "What's it called?" Aunt Catha said, "The Alamo." Bit of silence, look of confusion. She said, "What's it about?" Now, friends, when you teach history for a living, it's moments like that that make you want to go shower with a toaster. But I've since learned that my young relative wasn't hopelessly obtuse. She's philosophical. Because in the years that have followed, people have begun to question things we thought we knew. It's a pretty good question. Now, what is the Alamo about? What's Texas history about? What's American history about? What is history? I've taught Texas history for more than 30 years. I've published seven books. I'm working on my 8th. I'm a fellow and a life member of the Texas State Historical Association. And I don't tell you these things because I'm trying to impress you, because, people in this room are surely smart enough not to be impressed by academics. But I want you to know that I've got some skin in this game. And you may, if you're not in the biz, you may be unaware of some of this stuff, because I have never seen, and I've done this for a long time, I've never seen the discipline so fractured as it is now. We used to be able to talk about consensus. Well, Steve, what is the consensus among historians? We haven't been able to reach a consensus in years. And especially in Texas history, we seem to have fallen into two camps, at least two camps, that are generally called the progressives and the traditionalists. And the progressives are more cutting edge in their interpretations. They say things like, and I quote, "The Alamo is a monument to white supremacy." And that statement in and of itself is not significant, because people say stupid things every day. What's significant is that was said by the chief historian of the Texas State Historical Association. The very people we have entrusted, the very institutions that we have entrusted with the preservation of our history, our culture, they're failing us. They've become the threat, but a lot of our institutions are failing us. Now, a lot of people say, "Now, Steve, are you talking about those damned revisionist historians?" I says, "No." I said, "Buddy, I'm a revisionist historian." Because this is one of the things that we learned in grad school. Every time I write an article, every time I write a book, I'm obliged to make an original contribution to knowledge. When you read one of Steve Hardin's books, you're going to learn something you didn't know before. I'm going to bring something new to the table, because that's what we were taught to do. Now, guys, anytime you bring something new to the table, once you go into the archives and dig, really dig and find somebody, and you know those moments, go, "Oh, nobody knows that except me." That's exciting. But when you do that, necessarily you revise the historical record. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we should be doing. But that's not what that is come to mean. What it's come to mean in a lot of people's minds, is Texas hating, American hating type of history. But that's not revisionism. That's something totally different. For God's sakes, when I was writing Tex and Eliot, I actually talk about Travis, and all based on sources, contemplating surrender and actually sending Tejanos out to kind of fill out, well, what would you feel? I mean, what maybe, would you think about us surrendering? Well, what he thought about surrendering is he ordered an assault right then, because he didn't want them to surrender. He wanted a victory. And I thought, oh my God, the DRT is going to crucify me. But they didn't, and I was surprised. And you know why they didn't? And I talk about controversial issues all the time, but my tone is not one of disparagement. And to a whole bunch of historians coming up, disparagement is about the only thing they bring to the table. When Bruce and Don and I were in grad school, we were warned about the dangers of presentism. And what that means is to interpret past events in terms of modern values and concepts. That's bad. You shouldn't do that. At least that's what we were taught. That's all they do now. Because they're not really interested, many of these cats, in understanding the past. What they want to do is shape the future. And that's fine. But friends, that ain't history. Another thing that we learned in graduate school, because we all had the same mentor who used to teach us that history, to be valuable, needs to be accessible. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but most history, academic history, is not on purpose. And I realized that I was ruining my students, because I had a very smart young man, fine writer. I sent him off to graduate school at my alma mater, Texas State. And when he was home on break, I asked him, I said, well, how are you getting on down there? I mean, did we prepare you? And he said, Dr. Hardin, let me tell you a story. I was taking a historiography course down there, and we were talking about writing, how a historian should write. And he said, I raised my hand and said, sir, shouldn't we try to make our writing accessible to a wide general audience? He said, absolutely not. You are writing for other scholars. But I have always embraced something that David McCullough, the best-selling, and he's not an academic, by the way, God bless him, but he said something that always resonated with me. No harm's done to history by making it something that someone would wish to read. And this is where we have an edge on the progressives. Because in only writing to 12 other people in the discipline, they are marginalizing themselves and they don't even know it. Now, when I talk to people about this, people say, well, Steve, these progressive historians, these new guys, these angry people, what are they trying to do? Now, I've got two words for them. Ideological subversion. Ideological subversion. And people scratch. I said, that doesn't make sense. Why are they trying to tear down America? Why are they trying to tear down Texas? Why? And I have two words answer for that too. I said, to what end? What are they trying to accomplish? Ideological conversion. Ideological conversion. And they tell me, and they'll say, well, Steve, I don't know why you're so upset. All we're trying to do is change the narrative. To what? That's the question. To what? And enter the Texas Center. My wife and I threw in very early. We became all 300 members because we believe in what the center is doing. We need a place like the Texas Center. Not to take sides, not to be, on one side or the other, but to keep us honest, to keep history honest, to be an honest broker, to keep us centered, to keep us Texas centered. Thank you very much.
I want to tell you a little story. It's pretty short. My wife and I started traveling. We'd always gone to the East Coast. We went to New England. We'd go to Montreal. We'd go to Vancouver. We'd go to different places. And at one point she said, we should start going to Europe. And so one morning we're sitting in this little cafe in Brussels, and the headquarters of NATO and European Union, and there's these two young, I guess I'll call them two young women, and they were from Canada, and I was talking to them. One was from Toronto, one was from Vancouver, and when it came my turn to say, where am I from? I said, I'm from Texas. And it kind of shocked me because, I didn't say, I'm from the United States. But, in sort of a parochial voice, I announced that I was from Texas. So I have found that is not uncommon when it comes to people who are traveling overseas, or even within the United States, that as an identifier, people don't say I'm from such and such, but they say I'm from Texas. And you don't really hear people going, I'm from Ohio. I'm from Iowa. You just don't really hear that. But I was born in 53. In the last week of 53, so almost 54. As I get older, that becomes more important. But I have always had an awareness of Texas, of a place called Texas, and why, even as a small child. And it has to do with having an older friend who saw Fess Parker, and then having another friend who saw John Wayne, and then, introduced me into Texas history and the Alamo at a very young age. What I really remember about growing up in the late 50s and the 60s is the topic of American history, and it's somewhat glorified. And we would now say, well, maybe it was too glorified, but it was what we were reared on. We were reared on, if you remember television, on westerns, on shows on World War II, which was a recent event. But I always had an awareness of Texas and the West. And I came from a family of readers. And this is important because reading and having a love for history go together. When I was in the fourth grade, I read the Iliad. Now, I can't say that I understood it, but I did my best to pick out all the battle parts and read those. When I was in the sixth grade, I read Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And not the 4-volume set, but the abridged version. But I still, as a child, I was immersed in history. And again, that came from a family that loved it. So, yeah, that is important. I think one of the things that we've got to inculcate. I remember as a child going to the library, little biographies on Stephen Decatur, on Abraham Lincoln, on Henry Clay, on all these people that we grew up with that were important to us. Now, I didn't set out to go to the Alamo, and I actually have Dr. Hardin to thank for me being at the Alamo, because he called me one night and said, "They're going to hire a historian down there. You may want to apply if you're interested." And so I applied, and the rest is history. So that's how I came to be at the Alamo. But I came to the Alamo with, like I said, a love of the Southwest and of Mexico. And it was a good fit. Now, here's the key. I always ask people when they like history, I say, well, what era do you like? Because everybody has an era. I like this era. I like the Elizabethan era, whatever. But I've always had an interest in all eras. Roman history, had an history, and, interest in European history, in, like I said, World War II. It's all been interesting to me. And it's all tended to meld together in an important sort of way. Now, I tend to look at history, and my line of demarcation is Star Wars. Not Ronald Reagan's Star Wars, but the actual movie Star Wars. Because, again, when I grew up, others after us, who were our heroes? Who were our heroines? And it was people from history. Things were based on history. And then when you get to Star Wars, there seems to be a disconnect where, again, pop culture and history are connected. But when you look at the Star Trek phenomena, and there are people in the world now that speak Klingon, but they probably don't know anything about George Washington. It is a major cultural shift of what we as a value, or as a society value. So I think that's very important. Now, at the Alamo, I came into contact with people from all over the world. And I literally mean from all over the world. And surprisingly, many of the people from different places knew more about the Alamo than you don't tell me anything about the Alamo because I was born in Texas. And it's like, okay, I won't. But sometimes, they got the story right. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were regurgitating John Wayne. But I'll never forget a group of Japanese businesswomen. And I don't speak Japanese, so they had an interpreter, but we were in the gift shop, and he's looking at a painting of Travis drawing a sword and drawing the line. And he pantomimed that for these Japanese businesswomen. He takes out his sword and he draws across a gift shop floor. And later I said, how did you know that story? And he said, John Wayne. Which is interesting because in the John Wayne version, Travis doesn't draw the line. But it's part of the ethos out there that the Alamo and Texas. And when I remember we had someone who sent us a picture of they were on a serviceman on duty in Korea, and his dry cleaner. He sent us a picture of his dry cleaner in the back. Big picture of the Alamo. These things were common. So people in the world, they know the Alamo. And like Dr. Hardin said, our challenge is to go, what do you know about the Alamo? What does it mean to you? Let us give you some guidance. Now, because I was faced with people that had little or no or poor knowledge of Texas history and the Alamo, my idea became, well, how do I make this meaningful? How do I explain this to people? How do I make it make sense? And that's what, as historians, we really want to do is as Dr. Hardin said, I want other historians to take what I'm saying and incorporate it in their work. But as a public historian, if you're from, name any town, I want your visit to the Alamo. I want your knowledge of Texas history to be meaningful to you and to be relevant. So, going back to the idea that I'm looking at world history, I'm looking at local history, looking at Texas history, it's not original to me, but the idea that all history is connected. And that all history, you can take the Alamo, you can take anything. It has an international component, it has a regional component, and it has a local component. So you can look at them individually, but they all coalesce into what you actually can take away from that story. And so what I tried to do is to look at what are the historical concepts that are true during Roman time, that are true during the French Revolution, that are true during the American Revolution, that are true during the Mexican Revolution. What are the things? And so I've worked with Don, and that's part of the curriculum that we've been working on is how do you teach people that there's a way to analyze history. There's a way to actually apply principles to it that make it relevant and understandable. And Texas is is the perfect place to put these principles into practice. We've already kind of mentioned on the fact that it's the geography. You go to Longview, talk to those people. They're Texans. You go to Amarillo, talk to those people. They're Texans. You go down on the border. Go to across from Reynosa, talk to those people. They're Texans. They're far apart. Culture may be different, but what makes them Texas? What is that unifying idea? So Texas, the geography, we've got a diverse geography. We have a diverse culture, and population. We can go back through different periods of history, and we can look at indigenous history. We can look at age of discovery and exploration. So Lupita talked about Spanish explorers. That's part of Texas history. You know, if you're an indigenous person and you're being explored, you know, that's part of Texas history. European exploration, colonization, age of revolution. You know, Texas Revolution is part of a bigger age of revolutions. Republicanism, and I'm not talking about the Bush family dynasty, but there's a reason that it's the Republic of Mexico. There's a reason that it's the Republic of Texas. So we need to be teaching about republicanism, westward expansion, cotton, railroads, cattle, oil, and more recently, aviation, space, and as we enter the 21st century, you know, the growth of technology. What's happening up in Austin. So, challenges I see for the future. One is to but to stand against the denigration of history that Steve was talking about, and to stand up for traditional Texas history. And we have to tell a better story. That's how you counter these things. You tell a better story. Do you want a story that makes you feel like crap? Or do you want a story that you're going, yeah, I want to be a part of that. Yeah, that's me. I'm from Texas. So that's what we need to be able to do. I'm going to tell you about Abraham Lincoln real quick. And one of the things that struck me about young Abe Lincoln, and it may be true, it may not be true, is him sitting by the firelight, learning to read and write, you know, using a shovel as his desk. Now, how that relates to me is the high school I went to, we didn't have shovels as desks, but the high school buildings were repurposed World War II Quonset huts. You know, and today you're going, oh, you got to have the biggest and the grandest facilities. You know, how can they learn? You know, we learned. And to me, this is the key to everything that we're talking about today. Is how do we rekindle that interest? How do we rekindle that desire for people to learn? To learn about their history, to learn who they are, to learn what it means to be from Texas. So I think that's our big challenge. So with that, I will walk away. Thank you very much.
Well, it was brutal. It was violent. It lasted way too long, but at the end, the right side prevailed. But enough about my experience last night in San Antonio watching my University of Houston Cougars defeat Arizona. I'm here to talk about the Civil War in Texas, and particularly my experience kind of telling the Civil War story of Texas, some of the challenges that I've faced, how I've grown to think about it, and what I think some of the opportunities are for organizations like the Texas Center to tell that story more effectively to a whole new generation of people that don't know it going forward. So to kind of recap, as Don mentioned earlier, I wrote a series of books on the Civil War battles in Texas. And for many years, it has been a challenge to actually persuade people that there were Civil War battles in Texas. And it turns out there were. And those Civil War battles were some of the most unique and interesting in the country. They really were. The challenge has always been for me to convince people to learn about them in order to appreciate them and understand them. And so very early on, my friend Don Frazier and I got connected up as friends and colleagues, and I became a charter member of the Don Frazier fan club. And we started writing books on these fairly obscure battles. But as Don said earlier, it's not enough just to write books. We have books, they're out there, and people will read them or they won't read them. Maybe they don't even know they exist. How do you tell a story like this to the public? So the first category of Texas history I would suggest is stories that are undertold. And not undertold in the sense that there are not words in print on them. It's just how do we get those stories to the consciousness of people and make them interested in it? So very early on, this has been more than 30 years now, I started giving Civil War battlefield tours in Texas. And I've probably given more battlefield tours in Civil War Texas than anybody else ever. And one thing I've learned is that people really enjoy those. And it's not just people that have the same kind of gray hair that I have. It's younger people as well. So I've started giving tours for children. I've started giving tours to particularly 7th grade classes. I've found is a great place to deliver the story of Texas, the Civil War, make people knowledgeable about them. So I call these the undertold stories, but I think they're still important. And the reason I say that is you really can't understand the story of Texas without understanding what happened in Texas during the Civil War. Take Houston and Galveston, where I reside kind of part-time. You cannot understand a massive city like Houston without understanding the Civil War story of Galveston and Houston and how those two things fitted together and how we ended up at the end of the Civil War with Galveston being the last remaining port. You just can't. Remaining Confederate port. You just can't. You've got to understand that story. So I think that those stories, Civil War in Texas, are largely undertold, and we need to make them familiar to new generations of people. The second category of stories that I think are important, and I've worked on over the years, involves something that we haven't discussed today at all that I know of, and that is the maritime history of Texas. In the course of researching my books on Civil War battles in Texas, I got very interested in the Union ships that were often parts of these encounters. They were an incredibly important part of this. And we have shipwrecks off the Texas coast and in Galveston Bay that are associated with these battles. Gradually over time, I got kind of in this niche, and I became the project historian for a number of important Texas shipwrecks, several of which have now been excavated or at least documented. And I'm currently serving as a Marine steward. I'm the only historian Marine steward for the Texas Historical Commission. And every time there's a big hurricane, something gets exposed on the beach, the THC sends out people like myself to investigate them, see what we can find out about it, and try to tell that story. But if I tell you that the Civil War in Texas on land is undertold, the general maritime history of Texas is way undertold. So I would call this more unexplored and evolving Texas history, because we know 100 times more about the Texas history stories on land than we do about the stories of Texas history that involve our maritime coast. And again, remember, we have a gigantic coast in Texas, and there are all those cultural and archaeological remains right off of the coast. Just this week, for example, I know many of you read about this incredible deep water wreck that was found, not in Texas, this is off of Mississippi, but the deep water wreck of a whaling ship that had gone down in the Gulf. And it's a beautifully preserved wreck, and it's going to be neat to see that thing actually documented and pulled up. But I got emails from a ton of people asking me, I didn't know there were whales in the Gulf of Mexico. And I certainly didn't know that there was a whaling industry at one time in the Gulf of Mexico, but there was. And so there are a lot of stories like that I think we're going to have to see develop over time. We've got to find a way to make them interesting and engage people. And like on one expedition I went on, we went out to the wreck of the USS Hatteras, did laser measurements all around it, and produced a 3D fly-through movie. NOAA did. It's online on YouTube, that the kids can actually dive through the wreck and see what remains of it. It's just fascinating stuff if it's presented correctly. So that's sort of my second category of stuff, evolving and unknown. And then the third category of things I would think about, particularly in my own career, are stories that are completely untold. And when I say untold, I mean completely untold. Some of you may know that I wrote a book that we published last year, and State House was kind enough to publish it for me on Juneteenth. And for many, many years, I would take people on battlefield tours down in Galveston, lead them to this vacant lot, and say, here something important happened. And I started leading these tours, like I said, 30 years ago. And it was not uncommon when I got there to this particular lot and said, this is important. This is really important ground. This is where the Juneteenth order was issued. And people would say, June what? They didn't even know what it was. I mean, it was not part of their community. They really weren't familiar with the story. And so this has been a story that I've been actually researching and working on for probably close to 40 years. The timing was just unbelievable last year. We put out the book, and then a month after the book came out, we had the nation's first Juneteenth holiday. But my book was the very first, and it is to this day, as far as I know, the only scholarly history of the events that actually took place in Galveston on Juneteenth. So think about that. We now have a national holiday for an event that is homegrown in Texas, that influences people not only in the United States, but now increasingly all over the world. And yet there was only one scholarly book on the subject that was published a month before the first celebration. Now, this is a story that has basically forced itself onto the national scene, and yet as a historical community, until my book, we still didn't have any agreement on what the basic facts were. Every year you'd see something in the newspaper about Gordon Granger coming up on a balcony and reading the Emancipation Proclamation to a huge crowd of people. Spoiler alert, that never happened, and there's no contemporary evidence that supports it. So we need to have a new understanding. We need to backfill some of these stories that are kind of forcing themselves into the public conscious, and we need to do a better job of researching those things, getting the facts out there, and making people aware of them. And I will say from my own experience, you might look at me and say, why is this guy writing about Juneteenth? And some of the groups I speak to, have that question as a natural thing. But what I have found is I give basically the same talk on Juneteenth, regardless of whether it is a civil rights group, and I've done a lot of those talks to black groups all across the country, or Sons of Confederate Veterans. It's basically the same talk. And what I've found is that people are interested in the facts behind the event. And if you present it in an interesting and engaging way, and you just tell them the facts behind it, they appreciate it, and people come away from that story with a new appreciation of, 1, what happened, 2, why it's important, and 3, what it means to Texans, Americans, and people around the world today. So in conclusion, I just want to say I think my little career, and I'm a non-academic historian, is sort of a microcosm of what's going on in Texas history generally. We have stories that are undertold that we need to tell to people in new and engaging ways. We have stories that are evolving and unknown, like our maritime history stories. And then there are big issues, things like Juneteenth, that we need to really fill in the gaps and make available to a whole history-loving community. And it's kind of like the Field of Dreams thing. If you build it, they will come. My belief is that if we do that, if we manage to tell these stories in the way I've kind of outlined needs to happen, I think people will come and appreciate it. And who is in position to help us build it and make those people come to us? My way of thinking, it's the Texas Center, and that's the mission I see, and I applaud them for it. Thank you.